Witness testimony continues today in the trafficking and racketeering trial of Sean Diddy Combs. A former stylist to the hip-hop mogul will return to the stand this morning. Yesterday, Deontay Nash recalled incidents in which he witnessed Combs' violence towards ex-girlfriend Cassie Ventura. Nash also testified that Combs was aggressive toward him personally. Combs has pleaded not guilty to all charges.
Deontay Nash, who was a friend and a part of their circle of friends, that styled Combs and styled Cassie for a lot of the performances and artistry that she did. He was there, and he really witnessed. He says he witnessed a lot of the abuse that she has described.
Beat a woman who was bleeding and then blamed everybody else in the room. That's the kind of guy I'm supposed to give the benefit of the doubt to. This is just one more in a pile of steaming you-know-what that is being lumped onto that man every single day. And it doesn't matter how expensive and skilled his attorneys are. You get the case you're given. And they were given a real stinker. And all I can say to this is it is a really good thing that Sean Puffy Diddy Love Puff Daddy Combs loves applesauce, because they serve that regularly in prison.
A celebrity stylist just walked into federal court and dropped a truth bomb that could shatter the carefully polished empire of Sean Diddy Combs. His name is Deontay Nash, and until now, he stayed quiet. But when the government called his name, everything changed. What he revealed inside that courtroom stunned everyone. This wasn't speculation. These weren't vague claims. This was a man who witnessed the darkest parts of Diddy's private world, up close for years. And now, he's finally speaking. Let's break it all down. From the moment Deontay Nash stepped into the courtroom, there was an undeniable sense that this wasn't about fame or revenge. He didn't walk in with the posture of someone trying to be seen or heard. There was no flair, no bold attitude, just a quiet, almost heavy presence. He carried himself like someone who had been pulled into something far deeper than he ever signed up for. His body language, his facial expressions, and even his tone suggested this wasn't a story he was eager to tell. And when the attorney asked if he wanted to be there, his answer was immediate and brutally honest. Absolutely not. That simple response set the tone for everything that followed. This wasn't going to be a performance. It was a release. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just the content of his testimony. It was the exhaustion in his voice, the weariness in his eyes. You could feel that he had lived with these memories for years, trying to move past them, only to find himself back in front of them, forced to unpack it all in front of strangers. That reluctance didn't weaken his credibility. It strengthened it. He wasn't there to exaggerate or dramatize. He was there because the silence had become too heavy to carry. Deontay's story began in 2008, when he responded to a Craigslist ad that seemed harmless at first. It was a gig for a stylist working with a music label. On paper, it sounded like the start of a dream career. But almost immediately, it became clear that this wasn't a typical job. His position placed him inside an environment where image was everything, but the reality behind that image was far more complicated. He wasn't just picking out outfits or adjusting looks for photo shoots. He was present in private spaces, witnessing interactions that weren't meant for outsiders. The more time he spent in that world, the more he realized how far removed it was from the public perception. In the courtroom, he didn't raise his voice or deliver shocking lines for attention. Instead, he spoke in a raw, unfiltered way that made his words land even harder. It was the kind of honesty that doesn't come from preparation. It comes from lived experience. And as he described his role, it became clear that he hadn't come forward to destroy anyone. He was there to confront his own past, to let go of the weight he'd been carrying, and to finally say the things he had kept to himself for far too long.
So he was explaining that he had worked with Diddy and Cassie from 2008 to 2018, so about a 10-year period. Then we get into the 2009 to 28 time frame, which is a long time, but Maureen Comey, who did the questioning under the direct examination, was essentially asking some foundational questions just about how much time Deontay spent with Cassie, and he said he spent pretty much every single day with Cassie. He said he saw Diddy and Cassie together, though, about once a week, but that's still a pretty often time. And then he was asked, what were the names that Diddy referred to Cassie as? So first, Deontay was like, oh, baby girl, Cassie. But then he said that Diddy would also refer to her as the B word. He would call her an SLUT. He would call her a... But he said it's the B word that was his favorite word to use in reference to his own girlfriend, that being Cassie. And he said He, being Deontay, said that Diddy would call Cassie an outright SLUT. And I'm sorry, guys, I know I have to be very careful with just the words that I can say on air, but Deontay explained that when Diddy would call her these names and when he would use these words against her, that Cassie would be sad. She would be depressed about this name calling.
Once Deontay became part of the inner circle, it didn't take long before he started to notice something deeply unsettling beneath the glamorous surface. At first, the dynamic between Diddy and Cassie seemed intense but manageable, like any high-pressure relationship shaped by fame, business, and constant attention. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into years, the energy between them began to reveal cracks that couldn't be ignored. There was a strange coldness in their communication, a lack of warmth that made even casual moments feel tense. What struck Deontay the most wasn't a single moment, but rather the pattern. Cassie's posture would shift whenever Diddy entered a room, as if she were preparing herself for something unspoken. Conversations between them were often one-sided, delivered with tones that didn't resemble those of equals. And while some might have interpreted those moments as creative disagreements or personality clashes, Deontay saw something different. It wasn't just the words being said, but how and when they were delivered. Diddy didn't speak to her like a partner. He issued commands, comments, and remarks that felt demeaning, often in front of others. Sometimes it was quiet enough to be missed. Other times, it filled the room. But what made the situation harder to digest was the silence of those around them. Stylists, assistants, producers, everyone saw it, yet no one stepped in. Deontay described the atmosphere as one where discomfort lived in the background, unspoken, but fully present. It was clear that a message had been established early on. This was Diddy's world, and in his world, things moved according to his terms. The home didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage where image management was constant and where Cassie's emotional state was often quietly overlooked. Her responses to certain moments weren't loud or reactive. Instead, they were quiet withdrawals. Her eyes would drift away, her presence would shrink, and her body language would say what her voice didn't. For Deontay, who was in close proximity to these interactions daily, it became impossible to pretend it was normal. What he saw wasn't the chaos of celebrity life or the stress of busy schedules. It was a persistent imbalance of energy, power, and control. And while the outside world saw headlines, photos, and interviews, Deontay saw the cracks forming behind the curtain slowly deepening with time. As Deontay remained close to the daily routines of the household, what he had once considered uncomfortable began to evolve into something more structured and deliberate. It was no longer just about tense conversations or sharp language. The environment began operating under unspoken rules, and Cassie's actions seemed increasingly monitored. One incident that stood out involved a night where she had gone out with friends. What should have been an ordinary evening became a triggering event. Deontay remembered the moment the call came in. Puff was on the line, his voice sharp and demanding, asking where Cassie was and why she hadn't asked permission. The intensity of his reaction was immediate. Cassie didn't argue or offer explanations. She simply packed her things and left, like someone who had already learned that the safest move was to comply quickly and without resistance. That kind of response didn't come from spontaneity. It came from repetition, from previous moments where hesitation might have led to greater consequences. And while there was no shouting in the room that night, the silence spoke volumes. Everyone around understood what had just happened, even if no one put it into words. What added another layer to this pattern was the quiet use of personal recordings as a tool for control. Deontay recalled moments where Puff would casually mention having footage, or suggest that certain things could be shown to others if needed. These weren't empty statements. They were laced with implication.
Deontay went on to explain that Diddy threatened Cassie a number of times, threatened to release her tapes, send those tapes to her parents, threatened to beat Cassie's behind, and it drove Cassie essentially crazy. She would cry, she would stay in the house. Deontay explained that Cassie would essentially cocoon up when Diddy would just call her these names, and Diddy threatened not to release her music, something that the government has talked about at length throughout a bunch of different witness testimony.
The suggestion wasn't just about embarrassment, it was about leverage. It created a dynamic where even privacy felt conditional. Cassie became more withdrawn during those times, moving through the day with a heaviness that couldn't be ignored. There was no need for confrontation when anticipation of consequences was enough to change behavior. Deontay noticed how her energy shifted in response to those remarks. She didn't push back. She adjusted, emotionally and physically, almost instinctively. What had once felt like a tense relationship now looked more like a controlled system, with boundaries and consequences that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. And for someone like Deontay, who had entered this world expecting creativity and opportunity, the realization of what was really happening became harder and harder to justify. Everything that Deontay had observed over the years seemed to converge on a single day that marked a turning point. It was during the build-up to the OVO Fest in Canada, a major event that Cassie was preparing to attend. The atmosphere that day was calm at first. Cassie was packing with Deontay and another assistant named Mia, going over travel details and making sure everything was ready. There was no sign that anything was wrong, no tension in the air. But when Puff arrived unannounced, the mood shifted instantly. He didn't enter with curiosity or calmness. He came in already upset, immediately accusing Cassie of ignoring his calls.
He's someone who has been very close with her over the years, and as you were saying, told us harrowing instances of violence that he witnessed between her and Sean Combs. In one story that he told, Cassie had been asleep on the couch. He said that Combs came into the apartment and yelled at her for not answering her phone. This is testimony that we heard from her, that he would get very angry if he couldn't reach her. He apparently then dragged her into a room and began hitting her until she whacked her head on the edge of a bed and there was blood everywhere. He also told us about threats that Cassie communicated to him from Combs. He threatened to her to get her parents fired, to release explicit tapes of her. And this was important too, because this was how Nash said he learned about the freak-offs she was engaging in, because he told her that she should just let Combs release those tapes. He would be in them anyways, Errol. And that's when she said that these were videos of her with other men and that she didn't want to partake in them, but Combs was making her.
What followed unfolded too quickly for anyone to stop. Puff's voice grew louder, and within seconds, things spiraled. Cassie tried to walk away, but he followed. Deontay watched, stunned, as Puff forced his way into the bedroom where Cassie had retreated. There were no arguments to mediate, no time to react. The sound of her head hitting the bed frame left no room for doubt about what had just happened. Deontay and Mia tried to intervene, grabbing towels, calling out, doing anything they could think of in the moment. But they were pushed aside as if their presence didn't matter. What stuck with Deontay even more than the event itself was the aftermath. Once things quieted down, there was no apology, no remorse. Puff simply looked at them all and said, "Look what y'all made me do." That sentence didn't just redirect the blame. It revealed the thinking behind the entire situation. It was as if everyone else had been responsible for triggering the reaction, rather than the person who caused the harm. That was the moment when Deontay could no longer rationalize what he had been witnessing all along. Up until then, there might have been moments of doubt, brief internal debates about whether things were just high-pressure misunderstandings, but after seeing the fear in Cassie's eyes, the injury, the way everyone in the room froze without knowing what to say, all of that uncertainty vanished. He realized he wasn't just part of a stressful workplace or a complex relationship dynamic. He had been inside something far more damaging. And even though that day eventually ended, and the group continued preparing for the trip as if nothing had happened, for Deontay, nothing would ever feel routine again. After the OVO Fest incident, Deontay began to recognize a different layer of control that had nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with quiet manipulation. It wasn't just about monitoring Cassie's movements or controlling her social interactions. It was about creating an atmosphere where she felt there was nowhere to run. Deontay described moments where Puff would reference personal information, the kind no one else should have access to, using it as a way to keep Cassie hesitant about every decision. He would imply that certain recordings or messages could be shared with people in her life. The threat was never loud or theatrical. It was calm, calculated, and always specific enough to feel real. And over time, Cassie seemed to absorb this pressure in silence. She wouldn't argue or express defiance. Instead, she would grow quieter, almost like she was trying to shrink from the space around her. Deontay began noticing that she would spend long periods alone, isolated by choice, perhaps trying to sort through the emotional weight of it all without alerting anyone. One of the most haunting memories Deontay shared was the time Cassie tried to get away by checking into a hotel, under a different name. At first, it seemed like she had finally found a way to breathe, even if just for a day. But then, Puff showed up at Deontay's place, asking questions, demanding answers, and eventually taking Deontay's phone to trace calls. What followed felt more like a mission than a search. Deontay was sent to the hotel with 2 others from Puff's team. When he reached her room, Cassie was terrified. She threatened to do something drastic if anyone came closer. That wasn't dramatics. That was fear in its rawest form. And even though Deontay tried to calm her down, he could tell that the emotional toll had reached a dangerous point. Downstairs, Puff's people waited, not to help, but simply to ensure she returned. The whole situation was designed to make her feel like escape was never really possible. Even when she got away, even when she hid, there was always someone ready to bring her back. That moment redefined everything for Deontay. It wasn't just about keeping Cassie close. It was about making her believe there was no alternative. As time went on, Deontay realized that it wasn't just Puff exerting control. It was the entire environment around Cassie that worked to keep her tethered. There were people within Puff's circle, including assistants, team members, and even close acquaintances who played subtle but crucial roles in keeping the cycle alive. When Cassie disappeared, someone would text her saying things had calmed down or that Puff was in a better place emotionally. These weren't just casual updates. They were carefully worded messages designed to lower her defenses and make her doubt her instincts. Sometimes she would respond. Sometimes she would return. Not because she truly believed the situation had changed, but because the pressure from every direction left her feeling like there was no other option. Deontay described helping her hide out at hotels under aliases, or sometimes at his own place when things felt especially tense. But those brief moments of peace never lasted. Calls would pour in, often non-stop. People would show up, and eventually, the emotional weight would draw her back into the same exhausting routine. The pattern became predictable, almost rehearsed, with the same people sending the same calming reassurances that disguised the larger control at play. There was one moment that left a lasting mark on Deontay. After preparing for an emergency by stashing $1,000 in his backpack, hoping it could help if they ever needed to leave on short notice, he returned home one day to find it missing.
Deontay said, Cassie goes with the security guard. He goes downstairs, tells Diddy that, she must have gone home, didn't see her. So Deontay says that when he leaves, Diddy's all mad or whatever, but he went to a hotel because he didn't feel safe going home that night. So he said he went home the next day and his backpack was stolen. And he had $1,000 cash, an iPad, his ID. And he said that he kept cash for hotels. So, just in case, and in case for Cassie, so they wouldn't have to use their names.
It wasn't the loss of money that disturbed him the most. It was the realization that even his quiet acts of resistance were being undone. That event symbolized how deep the reach of the system truly was. Nothing stayed private. Nothing was safe for long. He began to feel the same kind of anxiety and uncertainty that had shaped Cassie's daily life. It wasn't always overt. More often, it came in the form of quiet gestures, persuasive messages, or unexpected disappearances. The very people who were supposed to offer support were unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, reinforcing the same walls that kept Cassie from finding stability. Deontay started to understand that this was more than just one person's influence. It was a network, a web that drew people in and convinced them to act against their better judgment. And the longer he stayed in it, the more he felt like escape was something that applied to both of them. There was a part of Cassie's experience that Deontay struggled to even describe at first. Not because the details were unclear, but because the atmosphere around those moments was so unlike anything he had expected when he took the job. Cassie would refer to certain nights as freak-offs, though even she seemed reluctant to say the word aloud. These weren't parties in the way most people would imagine. There was no sense of celebration or excitement. These nights were scheduled, highly controlled, and carried an emotional weight that made everything feel unnaturally quiet in the hours leading up to them. Deontay observed how Cassie would begin to prepare in a very specific and calculated way. She would pack certain items without explanation, move more slowly, and retreat into herself emotionally. Her energy became muted, and her expressions grew distant, like she was mentally trying to disconnect from what was coming. When the evening finally arrived, she wasn't fully present. Her voice softened, her steps became slower, and it felt like she was simply going through the motions. Deontay also noticed the presence of substances during these nights, not used for enjoyment, but seemingly to reduce awareness or resistance. The entire mood shifted from anticipation to something much heavier, something more rehearsed than spontaneous. One night in particular left a lasting mark on Deontay. It was New Year's Eve in 2017, and the group had been placed on the same floor of a luxury hotel in Las Vegas. As the day wore on, Cassie had yet to be seen. According to Puff, she had been sleeping for nearly an entire day. Eventually, Deontay was asked to check in on her. When he entered her room, she remained motionless at first, her body still under the covers as if disconnected from time. When he softly called her name, she eventually rose, not startled or alarmed, but with a blank acceptance. There was no confusion in her eyes, no urgency in her actions. It was as though she already understood what the night would require of her. Later, Puff made a comment that Deontay would never forget. He said he had spent a lot of money, so Cassie needed to make an appearance. That single sentence reframed everything. It turned the situation from a gathering into a transaction, one where presence was expected, regardless of emotional or physical condition. In that moment, Deontay fully understood the structure of what he had been witnessing. This wasn't a chaotic lifestyle or a string of bad nights. It was a system of expectations carried out behind closed doors where individual well-being was replaced with performance and compliance. Deontay's experiences were not limited to observing what Cassie endured. Over time, he found himself on the receiving end of unexpected hostility, confirming just how far the sense of control extended. There was one day during a video shoot that made this undeniable. Deontay stepped outside for a brief break. Just a moment to clear his head. There was no warning, no exchange of words that led up to it. Puff approached him suddenly, grabbed him, and shoved him against a car. In a moment of pure force, his hands went to Deontay's neck. The accusation was strange and personal. Puff told him he had been going out too much, as if even his off hours had become subject to the same scrutiny and restrictions. For Deontay, this wasn't just an isolated moment of anger. It was a message. Control in that world was not reserved for one person or one relationship. It touched everyone in the circle. What was most chilling wasn't just the act itself, but how those nearby reacted. No one intervened. No one asked if he was okay. People saw it happen and simply carried on, as if this kind of behavior was just part of the environment they all existed in. Despite the physical nature of that moment, Deontay never filed a report, not because it wasn't serious, but because he understood the rules of the system he had been living within. Speaking out had its risks. Staying silent had always felt safer, even if it meant carrying that weight internally. When asked during his testimony if he still spoke with Puff, Deontay surprised the courtroom with his answer. He said yes.
And again, he was someone who was not just inside Combs's and Cassie's inner circle as a stylist, he was one of Cassie's best friends. So he really was hearing from her in real time what she perceived was happening.
And they're still very close, right?
Very close. In fact, he said that he spoke to her yesterday to congratulate her for the birth of her baby boy, which is really kind of an incredible turn of events after her testimony that we saw across the course of 4 days. Of course, she was very pregnant when she testified, but Deontay Nash was asked about how close he was with Cassie still, and he said, "We're very close. You know, I spoke to her yesterday." He was also, by the way, asked if he still speaks to Combs, and he did admit that he has stayed in touch with him. He said it in a very nonchalant way, basically like, of course I would talk to him. He's Sean Combs. And when asked how he feels about him being there today in court, he said, "I don't hate him. It's not in me."
He admitted that there was no hatred in his heart, not because he excused what had happened, but because he had spent so long navigating the emotional confusion of that world. That numbness had taken the place of outrage. His words revealed a deeper truth about people who remain in toxic environments. Loyalty, fear, and emotional exhaustion can create a fog that makes clarity difficult to find. Over the years, Deontay had helped Cassie disappear when she needed to, protected her in the ways he could, and kept her secrets close. But he also remained silent for a long time. That silence, more than anything, was what his testimony sought to break. He wasn't there to destroy someone's reputation. He was there to finally tell the truth. And once that truth was spoken, it couldn't be taken back. When the courtroom finally quieted after Deontay Nash's testimony, it wasn't just the end of a witness statement, it was the beginning of a much larger reckoning. His words, calm but heavy, didn't just describe a few troubling incidents. They revealed a world behind the public image that had been carefully maintained for decades. This wasn't about chart-topping records or business deals. This was about what happens behind the closed doors of powerful circles, where reputations are protected at all costs and silence is often the currency. Deontay didn't deliver a speech full of rage or demand sympathy. He shared what he had seen and what he had lived through. And the weight of his testimony came not from exaggeration, but from the simple fact that it was real. The image many had of Diddy as a successful mogul, entrepreneur, and cultural icon now stood next to a very different portrayal, one built from first-hand experiences that had remained hidden for far too long. What made it even more powerful was the way Deontay framed it. He wasn't trying to destroy a legacy, he was simply trying to free himself from the burden of keeping these truths locked inside. But his story, as important as it was, is just one part of a much bigger puzzle. Other witnesses are preparing to come forward. Some are asking for anonymity, hoping their identities can remain protected. That level of fear says more than any headline ever could. It's no longer just a courtroom hearing. It is a cultural turning point. The industry that once elevated certain figures without question is now being asked to confront what it looked away from for so long. And for viewers, for fans, and for people who believed in the public personas built over years, it's a moment to reassess everything. Deontay Nash didn't enter that courtroom with the goal of changing an industry, but his testimony opened a door that will be impossible to close. What comes next will depend on who else is willing to speak and whether the world is finally ready to listen. Because now that the silence has been broken, there's no turning back. The truth is out there, and it is demanding to be heard. If you made it this far, you're not just a viewer. You're someone who cares about what really goes on behind the scenes. Stories like Deontay's don't surface often, and when they do, they have the power to change everything. But only if people are paying attention. So, if this video opened your eyes or made you question what's been hidden in plain sight, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to push this story further. Subscribe if you want the full truth as more witnesses come forward, and drop a comment below. Your voice matters. Whether it's disbelief, anger, or support for those speaking out, this is your chance to be part of a conversation that's long overdue. We're just getting started.